You donated to charity this morning. You chose the salad at lunch. You held the door for a stranger. By every measure, you are doing well today. So tonight, when you skip the gym, snap at someone you love, or spend 2 hours on something you told yourself you'd stop doing, it doesn't feel like failure. It feels almost earned. That quiet permission is not a personality flaw. It is a documented feature of the human moral system, and it is quietly undoing a lot of your best intentions. You probably didn't notice it happening. That is what makes this particular pattern so difficult to catch. You made a genuinely good choice, and something in your mind registered it, not just as a good thing, but as credit. A small surplus in an invisible account you didn't know you were running. Psychologists call this moral licensing. The idea is straightforward, but the implications run deeper than most people expect. When you do something that feels virtuous, you don't simply feel good about it. You feel like you have earned some latitude, like the scales have shifted slightly in your favor, and now a small transgression won't tip them back. This is not a cynical view of human nature. It is a description of how the moral self actually operates under pressure. The mind doesn't record your good deeds as proof of character. It records them as credit, something that can, quietly, be spent. What you will come to understand by the end of this is not that your good deeds are hollow. They are not. It is that the mind treats morality less like a stable trait and more like a running balance sheet. And once you can see that accounting clearly, you can start to work with it instead of being quietly governed by it. The clearest window into moral licensing comes from a series of studies by Nina Mazar and Zhong, published in 2009. People who were first given the chance to buy green, environmentally friendly products were subsequently more likely to cheat and steal in a later, unrelated task. Not slightly more likely, meaningfully more likely. The good act had created a kind of moral cushion, and people were spending it without knowing. What surprises me most about this finding is how clean it is. The participants were not consciously reasoning that they had earned the right to behave badly. They weren't aware of any trade-off at all. The licensing happened beneath the level of deliberate thought. This connects to earlier work by Benoit Monin and Dale Miller, published in 2001, which first gave the mechanism its name. They showed that when people establish their moral credentials in one domain by expressing unprejudiced views, for example, they become measurably more willing to express prejudice in a different situation shortly afterward. The established credential provided psychological cover for the contradiction. The mechanism seems to run through identity rather than through conscious reasoning. When you do something good, it doesn't just change your behavior in that moment. It changes how you see yourself. You feel established as a good person, and once you feel established, the internal pressure to prove it through your next action quietly drops. The work, in some sense, feels done. That is where the trouble begins. Moral licensing rarely looks dramatic. It operates in the ordinary margins of daily life, which is precisely why it evades notice. You have a difficult conversation and handle it with unusual patience. Later that day, you are short with a colleague, and somewhere in your reasoning is the quiet sense that you have already done the emotional work today. You go to the gym 3 mornings in a row. On the 4th morning, you decide you deserve the rest. That rest extends into the week. You spend an hour volunteering, then find yourself justifying an impulsive purchase that contradicts the careful budget you had been keeping. Kahneman, in Thinking Fast and Slow, published in 2011, describes a broader principle that underlies all of this. The mind is motivated not by absolute standards, but by relative ones. We compare our present self to a recent version of ourselves, not to some fixed ideal. If the recent version was virtuous, the present self gets graded on a curve. The strange part is that licensing does not even require you to have actually done something good. Research in this area suggests that simply planning a virtuous act or imagining yourself doing one can produce the same effect. The mind credits intention almost as generously as it credits action. The licensing can begin before the good deed has occurred. This touches something Viktor Frankl explored from a very different direction. A point central to his thinking in man's search for meaning is that meaning and responsibility cannot be banked or outsourced. They renew themselves in each moment. The credit does not carry forward, but the psychological system most of us actually run on behaves as though it does. Knowing about moral licensing does not make you immune to it, but it changes your relationship to those moments where a quiet negotiation is happening just below the surface. The most useful reframe is this: good actions are not withdrawals from a moral account. They are expressions of who you are trying to become. That distinction matters. One framing treats virtue as a resource that depletes. The other treats it as a direction that continues. The same action belongs to a different story depending on which frame you bring to it. One practical approach is simply to notice when you are reasoning from credit. Not to punish yourself for it, just to name it. I am using this morning's good choice to justify this evening's bad one. That moment of naming tends to dissolve the permission because it makes the usually invisible accounting visible. Research in this area also suggests that the licensing effect weakens when people reflect on their values in broad terms rather than on specific past actions. When you ask yourself not, "What did I do today?" but "What kind of person am I trying to be?" the moral ledger loses some of its grip. The reference point shifts from a single transaction to an ongoing identity. This is ultimately what the research on moral licensing points toward. Not shame about the lapses it produces, but a more honest model of how the moral self actually functions. Not as a fixed character standing above its choices, but as something built and rebuilt through each one. If that gap between who we think we are and how we actually behave under pressure is something you want to understand more clearly, that is exactly the territory this channel keeps returning to. It is worth staying for.